folks, welcome back to the Podcast Digest. This is episode 103, and for those of you counting, might know that my last recommendation show was episode 94. That is 9 episodes ago, and longtime listeners will know that I have said many times that usually every 8 to 10 episodes or so, I like to bring on a co-host and just kind of chat about great shows that we're listening to once again add to your subscription list and give you even more wonderful things to listen to, and it's exactly what we're doing this week here on episode 103. Before we jump into that, I just wanted to say, folks, I hope that you have enjoyed the recent episodes post-Chicago and podcast movement. I've been having a blast, especially with the technology theme. I've kind of jumped back on here in 101 and 102 with Yasmin Evan and Ben Brock Johnson and Claire Tennisketter from Codebreaker, 2 excellent shows that I hope you're now listening to. And we're going to give you 4 more right now, and not all of them are technology, but a little bit of that and some other things as well. And for my co-host this week, I've reached out to a person who came to some recent prominence, if you will, in those technology circles, based on a YouTube video that she created that I want to ask her all about and tell you folks about. But come to find out, it's not just this video. She is a huge fan of podcasts in general, especially several of the technology shows that I also listen to. And also come to find out that she's also a podcaster. So I would love to introduce all of you guys to Quinn Rose. Quinn, welcome to the Podcast Digest.
Hello, thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
Well, thanks for joining me, Quinn. And there's lots of stuff that I want to tell people about that you're doing. 1, because I've quickly become a fan of it. And 2, because I think they're really going to enjoy the story. But before we jump into your podcasting, your love of podcasting, your YouTube channel, I'd like to have folks get to know a little bit about the people that appear on this show. So can you tell folks a little bit about yourself, sort of before we jump into all that fun stuff?
Sure. So I am going into my junior year of college right now. I'm studying sociology, which if you end up watching any of my YouTube videos, there's probably going to be a lot about sociology because I'm completely in love with the discipline. I'm also pretty much a huge geek in general, really into games, and YouTube and podcast is my most recent, I say recent, it's been like 2 years, but we'll say one of my more recent obsessions that I'm really into. And
that obsession turned into they crossed, right? Your YouTube videos you mentioned about your college major and your love of podcast cross recently. So for folks who are saying, looking at my episode title right now, who's Quinn Rose? Let's tell them who you are. What did you do recently that sort of blew up everything that you had going on before then in terms of views and exposure? What? Tell folks what that was.
So the story behind this is one day I was waiting in a line or something and was playing a little game with myself of an alphabet game. As you pick a topic and you come up with something related to that topic that fits for each letter. And because I really love the podcasting network Relay FM, I decided to choose that as my topic. And I came up with everything pretty quickly. And then I decided this would be a cute video. So I printed off a bunch of pictures. I made this very short, silly alphabet video for Relay FM, put it on YouTube, and then tweeted it and happened to tag Mike Hurley, Stephen Hackett, Casey Liss, and the Relay FM Twitter in the tweet. Now, I really wasn't expecting anything to come of this. I think I had tweeted at Mike a couple times before, and, he might like your tweet or respond to you, but I wasn't expecting anything really more to happen. Well, I put it away for about half an hour, came back. My notifications were completely blowing up. All of the Relay FM hosts were starting to respond to me, retweet it, comment about if they weren't chosen for a letter. The Material podcast in particular seemed offended that I chose Marco Arment instead of Material. And before this, I think I had 13 followers on Twitter. I had a very small internet presence. And then all of a sudden, this is getting shared everywhere on pages that have tens of thousands of Twitter followers, and I'm suddenly getting a lot more attention than I expected.
Well, and it's awesome. And folks, I will specifically have a link to that video in the show notes as well. And if you're listening to the Podcast Digest right now, I would hope that you're at least a mild fan of technology, and you probably have heard of Relay FM. It is one of my top networks as well, having had, I need to do a count, Quinn, but I don't even know, 8 or 9 of the, I mean, I've had all 3 material hosts, and both Mike and Steven and Casey, I've had them all on the show, and every single person I've talked to, from Andy Anatko to Jason Snell, John Syracuse, so on and so forth, have been so kind and so down to earth, and I hope that you folks have enjoyed listening to those conversations. But I've been listening to technology shows forever. I'm more or less a tech geek. That's well established. But Quinn, how did you find out about Relay? How did you get into sort of the tech-based podcasts?
So if we were to make kind of a graph of my podcasting history, at the center of it would be CGP Grey. Because as it happens, I actually got into the podcast Hello Internet first. Like, that was the first podcast that I was ever really into, and that sort of started me on listening to podcasts in general. And then one fateful day, CGP Grey started a podcast with Mike Hurley, one of the co-founders of Relay FM. I had no idea who he was, which is actually kind of amazing because I listened to Hello Internet, the Accidental Tech Podcast, and The Incomparable, which are all very, like, all of those hosts are also on the Relay FM network, but I'd somehow never heard of it before. But once I started listening to that podcast, which is Cortex, I looked into Relay FM, discovered all these other hosts that were really interesting, picked up a bunch of different shows, and then that was pretty much it. From that point on, I think I listened to 10 or 11 Relay FM shows at this point regularly.
They do put out a high volume, don't they? It's hard to keep up.
Yeah, they just started a new one called Free Agents.
Yep. And
it's about working for yourself, and I'm very excited about it because I need help.
Yeah, that is Jason Snell and Max Sparky. Name's escaping me now, which is Katie Floyd's co-host on Mac Power Users, which I'm going to catch crap, I imagine, for forgetting it. David. It's escaping me right now. But yeah, Free Agents is one of their newest ones. But it seems like always Relay is releasing new shows constantly. So that's a little bit about your podcasting history, but your love of Relay, or I should say maybe your love of podcasts in general. Well, you tell me. You have your own show, yes? Tell us about it.
I do, which, again, I made a video recently where I talked about a little bit of my history with podcasts. So I feel like Relay FM really inspired me to start a podcast because of the show Cortex, where they talk a lot about starting your own internet projects and side projects. And then I was inspired by this idea of a podcast network because I really didn't know that was so much of a thing before, that people could just professionally make podcasts by themselves. That was really interesting. And so I started my own podcast, which is called Solidly Mediocre. And it's hosted by, it's somewhat similar format to this podcast because I'm the regular host, and then I have my friends co-host it with me in a rotation, which is funny because almost none of them actually listen to podcasts, but they're all very excited to be a part of this one, even though I feel like some of them I kind of forced into it. And so we mostly talk about college because that's what we are currently experiencing. So we talk about different topics related to college, and we also have a series going on every other episode. We review a different movie. I'm calling it my Millennial Movie Review because they're all movies that sort of have to do with the quote-unquote millennial generation.
Yeah, you did one recently. I was able to listen to the last few. He's Not That Into You, right? That was a recent episode.
Yeah, and that was one of the that was a recent episode. I think that was the most recent episode that was released when the Alphabet video started getting a lot of attention. So a lot of people were downloading that one episode of us talking about the movie He's Just Not That Into You. It's like, I'm not sure this is the first impression I wanted to make, but all right.
I thought it was a great, and one of the great thing about podcasts, and there are hundreds of examples about this, is it's able to bring a personal side to people, to types of people, to segments of the population, to belief systems, what have you, that you may not normally hear. And me, I'm 37 years old. It's been a while since I've been in college. And to hear sort of the college perspective on any number of topics, I think is super cool. And it allows listeners like me to kind of peel back that curtain that we may have long forgotten or never had the experience of in the first place, or, you hear things on the news or get a filtered perspective from other sources. But podcasting allows you to kind of hear it directly from the source. So I think that's one of the cool things that you guys are doing with your show.
Thank you very much. I kind of made it never really expecting it to do much. It was just something that I always really wanted to try since I started getting into podcasts. I was like, I want to make one of these. And I had friends who I could force to do it with me. And so it was almost kind of practice for myself. And I was thinking, I can do this thing, and then maybe one day I'll be good enough to do this for real. And then people started listening to this thing a little bit, so maybe there's hope for it yet.
And last question on that topic, Quinn. Have you quote unquote caught the bug? Have you done enough now where it's like, oh, I could see myself keep doing this type deal? Is it like you have that itch now? Absolutely.
I have many podcast plans of podcasts that I want to make that I physically cannot make all of. So we'll see what happens with that. But I can feel how much I just want to keep making podcasts.
Yeah, it's a thing, that's for sure. So anyone out there listening, thinking about starting one, man, all you do is you start, and it's very hard to stop. It's not all flowers and clouds. There's clouds with the flowers, but it's on the whole, I think it's something that most people would really enjoy.
Yeah, absolutely.
And let's talk about YouTube. We mentioned it briefly with the relay video that you put out, but you've had other videos out there, and your most recent one, at least at the time of the recording, and folks are going to be hearing this a little bit later, but something that I thought that you did, and I was like, oh, that's a super good idea. You did a goals video, right?
Yes, I did. So I made a video of my goals for August not because I thought that was particularly amazing content for anyone else to watch, but because now it's in the universe, and if I come back and say I didn't do any of my goals, there are people to yell at me for it. This is something that some people do on YouTube, is just make videos of their year goals or their monthly goals, and I was like, you know what, I'm going to do that, because there'll be at least one person out there who will feel the need to tell me if I don't do these things, and that's what I need right now.
I can also see yourself going back on the 28th of August, rewatching it, and you're like, okay, check, and then all of a sudden quickly being like, oh boy, this is going to be a long weekend.
I almost guarantee you that I will do that.
Well, before we jump into our show recommendations, regular listeners of the recommendation show here on the Podcast Digest, Quinn, know that before we jump into that, we're going to have a little discussion topic. And I kind of want to wind into a lot of the things we were just talking about, which is kind of what I believe is a crossroads that YouTube and podcasts are at. Now, interesting, we were talking about Cortex, and we were talking about Mike Hurley, CGP Grey. Mike says that, it was his first YouTube producing experience because Cortex also goes out as a YouTube video, so to speak. It's just the audio, but that is also released in that way. The company I host with, which is Libsyn, most people know that, just released YouTube as a destination. So now all the Podcast Digest episodes are now available on YouTube. And when I knew that you had done YouTube work, especially this one that kind of, went a little crazy for you with the Relay Alphabet, I wanted to get your perspective on what are your thoughts about sort of the differences between YouTube and podcasting, since you do both, and what do you think their relationship is or could be or should be?
This is a really fascinating question because there are so many aspects of it. The YouTube world and the podcast world are kind of like two sides of the same coin, where there's a lot of people on YouTube who are also making podcasts. Like even just if you are a really big YouTuber per se and you are pulling in millions of subscribers, it's almost surprising if you don't also have a podcast at this point. But on the other hand, there aren't a lot of really big podcasters who then move to YouTube. I mean, there might be some, but I honestly can't think of any who started with podcasts and then moved to YouTube. And so they have this weird relationship where the cultures of the two kinds of media are pretty different, but they're starting to cross over more and more with these people. And then with hosting podcasts themselves on YouTube, it enters this really weird zone because of numbers. Because podcast numbers are generally pretty secret. We don't know how many people are listening to a podcast. But everyone knows exactly how many people are watching YouTube videos because the numbers are public in virtually every single channel out there. So it becomes this question of like, which way is the culture going to shift? Are we going to shift more towards the YouTube end where things are very open and there's a lot more cross community, or more towards podcasts where things are becoming more closed and you get networks and communities that aren't necessarily crossing over with each other?
No, I think you're right, and I think you raise a lot of good points there, especially on the front where podcasters moving to YouTube. It's not something you see a lot. I was going to interject at one point, Twit is one thing that comes to mind with Leo Laporte, but I don't even know if that's true blue YouTube videos other than they're really produced as video podcasts that are also distributed on YouTube. Mm-hmm. But in that sense, where I'm thinking about it is this concept, and this was the concept that I thought about it when I used the Libsyn destination to throw all the Podcast Digest back episodes out on YouTube, and this episode is coming out on YouTube as well. Now it's a regular weekly release, is that people say, now I don't do this. Now, you're a little bit younger than me. You're in college, so maybe you're the right person to ask about this. That YouTube audio listening is a big deal, right? So YouTube released YouTube Red, right, for the music subscriptions, because there's always been a huge music component to YouTube. I'm also a mobile DJ focusing on weddings, and most of the time when brides will send me first dance suggestions, father-daughter dances, etc., they will send me a YouTube link. That seems to be the reference point. But unlike a podcast app on an iPhone, are people really opening YouTube and listening to audio delivery regularly?
See, this is kind of my question because I do not do this. Absolutely not, because I don't find YouTube a good form for this. Partly because I don't have YouTube Red and I can't close the screen and keep listening to it. So that just shuts that out completely. And I think most people can't. And I think most people are in the place where they can't shut off the screen and keep listening to anything. So that's not going to work at all.
Right.
But if either you don't care about that, or you do subscribe to a service where you can turn off the screen and keep listening, then that changes the game completely, because YouTube is all about discoverability. So if you're used to the YouTube format where you watch something and then something else comes up that's related that you're also interested in, and you want to have that for audio, then why not listen to your audio on YouTube? And you can keep discovering new things. You don't have to worry about different platforms. And I think you're right that this is going to be something that younger people use, perhaps younger than me, because again, I look at this and say, no, why would you do that? There are podcast apps out there.
Right. I guess here's the situations I could imagine, right? From a college student perspective, or somebody like me who's in an office all day. In my office all day, I certainly can have a Chrome tab open and running constantly, right? So I could potentially throw a podcast that's hosted or featured on YouTube up there, and that may almost be preferable than going to the podcast website or whatever the case may be, especially to your point, potentially the idea of a running playlist or cycling through related content or recommendations. Or from a college student perspective, I'm sitting down for the next 4 hours to write this paper, and I can throw YouTube up next to my Word document, a YouTube tab. So I can see those situations making sense. But like you said, on a phone, and even if you have YouTube Red, and I could be wrong here. I think I am wrong here, because I too am not a YouTube Red subscriber, but I don't know, similar to a podcast app, if you could go out and then through YouTube download podcast episodes. And if you could, I don't think it would work as easily or as conveniently as tapping that down arrow on a list of episodes on your favorite show.
Yeah, I think you're right. I don't think there's any kind of download feature at this time.
Yeah, see, and that kills it for me right there because I'm a download podcast listener. I know there's streamers out there. I'm not one of them. My office has a very weak cell signal. If I streamed, I would get completely crazy by the stuttering and stopping and what have you. But it's an interesting concept of podcasts and YouTube because I think a lot of podcasters are wondering, like, do I need to be there? Is there an advantage to be there? I mean, I've only been in there for a couple of weeks. But it's hard to gauge at this point if there's any real benefit. What about the difference in producing each? When you go to release a podcast episode or you go to make a YouTube video, what about in terms of preparation or planning or your own outlook at each creative venture? What are the differences for you in your mind?
So I would say YouTube definitely has more to think about it just because it literally has an additional dimension of the visual aspect. So, for example, right now I'm on this podcast and I'm gesturing very wildly with my hands because that is more comfortable for me to talk. But I don't do that on a YouTube video because that would look a little silly. So when you're preparing for a video, you have a lot more to think about. But at the same time, you have less to deal with when you actually get to the service. Some people have a lot of problems with the YouTube backend in terms of inconsistency, but for the most part, it's fairly simple. You get a video file, you upload it, it's free, you're on YouTube, you're set to go. You can tag it, it can be discovered by other people. There's all sorts of games you can play with that, but it is easily possible. Whereas with podcast, you have to figure out where do I want to host it? How do I want to promote it? Is there some kind of service that's better than another service that I can be on? And it's a lot more confusing on the back end.
Yeah, that's for sure. There is no YouTube for podcasts, so to speak. I mean, iTunes, but it's still platform specific, so to speak, whereas YouTube is everywhere.
Yeah.
So for you personally, Quinn, do you see this being a dual creative venture for you where you will continue to produce YouTube videos and as well as your podcast, or can you see one winning over the other, or can you see conversely sort of them melding? Could you see Solidly Mediocre becoming a YouTube entity?
So I want to say one semi-side note about this, but it relates to it, is there's also people on YouTube who integrate their podcasts in their YouTube videos, but not by putting their podcasts on YouTube. What a few people do is they have their podcast, but they also separately make a video really on the same topic. Or maybe they have visual podcasts, so they record themselves talking and then they upload one portion of that, 1 5-minute clip that's the most exciting part on their channel, and then you can listen to the full version on their podcast page. So that's potentially something that I could do in the future, is have more integration between my YouTube and my podcasts. For now, I'm going to keep doing both and keeping them relatively separate, except when I make fan videos about other podcast networks. Because, like I said before, the two different types of media are pretty different. The cultures are different, and I feel very drawn to both of them. I think I do feel more in the podcast realm, partly because it just feels like a more, I don't want to say grown-up space, but the general age does trend older. There is a more degree of professionalism on podcasting, and I do consume more podcasts than I consume YouTube. So that's the space that I'm drawn towards more, but I also still love YouTube, so I'm going to still keep doing that, at least for now. Well,
links to Quinn's podcast and YouTube channel, as I mentioned, folks, will be in those show notes as well. So follow along with what Quinn's got coming up, and we'll see not only if her August goals come true, but as well as these predictions about the future of your project. So,
we'll see. Thank you.
So let's jump into some show recommendations. That's why people are here. They want to hear about some more good stuff to add to their subscription list. So we've got 2 each, and I usually I tell people, my co-hosts, what I'm going to be talking about, and just realized, Quinn, I haven't told you, but I know I haven't heard.
To me too.
I know I haven't heard yours, so I'm definitely interested to hear your take on them. But would you like to go first, or would you like me to set the example?
You can go first and set the example.
All right, perfect. All right, folks, show number one from me for this week's recommendation episode is one that I said last week, folks, you guys are going to be hearing more and more about Chicago Podcast Movement 2016. I was so fortunate to meet so many amazing people. And the CBC had a booth/table there with a couple of their producers and hosts who I talked to. And I found out about a show there that was immediately intriguing to me. And I pretty much came home, subscribed, and have been plowing through it ever since. And it is amazing. I know from looking at their Twitter account, some of you, if you are listening, probably already know about this, but I have a feeling a lot of you don't. This show is called Someone Knows Something. This is a podcast from CBC from the Canadian award-winning filmmaker and writer David Ridgen. He pretty much hosts and produced and put together this whole thing. Of course, he had co-producers as well, executive producers. Ashley Walters, Sandra Bartlett, Steph Kampf, and Arif Noorani are some of the credits listed for the show. This show is about as I mentioned, a documentary filmmaker who has done documentaries on missing persons. And this podcast is about I'm going to get the number here, 43, I believe it's 43-year-old missing child from Ontario in Canada. Back in 1972, a 5-year-old boy who went missing when he was fishing with his grandfather, his brother and sister. He had trouble with a line. His father tried to help him, and he said, I don't want to fish anymore. He went back near a large rock and was sort of throwing rocks and what have you. Parents turned around, father turned back, and he was gone. And for 43 years, nobody has found anything about what happened to him. There was no body discovered. There was no anything. There was an exhaustive investigation done in 1972. What happens is David Ridgen, who happened to also be from the same hometown where this happened, returns to his hometown and basically all these years later retakes up the case, starts interviewing some of the residents who still live there, the family, of course, who still affected, the surviving parents as well as the siblings. They get sketches done, sort of these aging sketches on what he may look like today. They had psychics involved back in the 70s on where this person, what happened to him. They brought out cadaver dogs to see if they found anything on the shore of the lake. And it's all documentary style. So he is literally in the field recording, standing on the edge of the water, talking to divers, talking to the people who have the cadaver dogs, talking to the family members. It's an amazing show. It's only 11 episodes. It started last fall, and then the series had to take a little pause due to a frozen lake, which I don't want to give away too much about what happens because I really want to encourage you guys to go check it out. But then it came back this spring before it tied up its first season. Now, from what I understand, there is going to be a second season, hopefully debuting this fall. They haven't said if it'll be on the same story with updates or if there'll be another sort of missing person that David Ridgen will go after to try to find out more. But during this process, it's amazing to hear these family members speak, to hear David go through the process of, his this hometown shared feeling of them looking for this poor 5-year-old who went missing, with all these different theories on, is he still alive? Was he abducted and raised in a healthy, happy family? Or did something happen? We just need closure and all this stuff. It is a tremendous listen. It will suck you in. You will immediately go from episode to episode to episode. Talk about your binge listening. This is one that you definitely will do that with, I promise you. And honestly, somebody that I really am going to hopefully someday be able to talk to on this show after meeting the folks in Chicago with the CBC. But my first show recommendation is called Someone Knows Something from the CBC. Links to the website and the Twitter account for news and updates on that will be in the show notes. So that's my first show recommendation. Quinn, you ever heard of that one?
I have not. That sounds really intense.
It is. It is a really interesting listening. I want to make sure I'm clear. It's not super sad. It's not super crazy. It's not, but it's just, if you're really into kind of like investigations and crime and kind of retracing the steps of the mystery type thing, you would love this show.
Awesome.
Yeah, definitely go check it out, folks. So, Someone Knows Something, that's show recommendation number 1. So I am throwing the talking stick over to you, Quinn. What's your first show recommendation? All
right. So speaking of YouTube and podcasts, my first show recommendation is called Hello Internet. So this actually, I'm pretty sure, is a very big podcast, and I'm excited that no one has talked about it on the Podcast Digest yet, and I get to talk about it. So it's hosted by CGP Grey and Brady Heron, who are both educational YouTubers. I was talking about Grey a little bit before. He has a YouTube channel under just his name. Brady Heron has many, many YouTube channels, including 60 Symbols and Numberphile and periodic videos. And Hello Internet is just them having a conversation, which makes it hard to recommend to people because I'm explaining that, it's these two 30-something guys just having a chat, and they're like, wow, that sounds fascinating. And I'm like, no, but it's really fun. So this is the original podcast that really pulled me into podcasting, like I mentioned. And it's one that I very much recommend, starting from the beginning and listening all the way through, even though it's been on for a while and it may seem kind of intimidating to start at the beginning, but it really builds. The reason that this podcast is so interesting is because Grey and Brady are so different. Grey is often compared to a robot. He is very logical, and over here, Brady is having a lot more fun. He's compared to a caveman in the animations that they have, which is clearly satirical, but it's the same idea. He's hard as nails. He's a real adventurer type. And through the course of the podcast, they talk about many different things. They talk about work on YouTube, current events. They had a conversation about Brexit recently. They talk about plane crashes surprisingly often for this kind of podcast. And along the way, they built up this amazing community. So they're both pretty active on the Hello Internet subreddit. And for every episode, they'll post a link to the episode on Reddit, and the community members will post hundreds of comments, and they'll respond to comments, read them, respond to them on the show. They always have tons of listener feedback. They have a recurring segment where people will send pictures of themselves listening to Hello Internet, doing various interesting things or at interesting locations, including the White House at some point. So all over the place, people are listening to this show. And most of recent events that really sums up this show is they had a flag referendum. They decided the New Zealand flag referendum wasn't being done well enough, so they had their own. They had people submit designs, chose a short list, then anyone in the world who wanted to could submit a postcard to vote for the final flag. They eventually chose it, and they actually sell flags from their online store with this official Hello Internet flag design. And if that's the kind of strange community nerdiness that appeals to you, this show is perfect for you.
I have no idea, Quinn, why I'm not listening to the show.
I don't know either.
Given my guest list and interest list. Yeah, and that's a great primer that you just gave in terms of those of us who, for some reason, haven't made it over there. But Hello Internet is a monstrosity in the podcast world. It really is. It is sort of the the two guys talking version of This American Life, really. They are always up high on the charts. They have a really huge following on Twitter. I think 25,000 followers on Twitter. They have over 1,500 Patreons. I'm looking right now on their Patreon page, and they are a big deal, if you will, in the world of podcasting. Do you remember how it was that you found out about this in the first place?
So this was actually recommended to me by a boy that I liked, which is a hilarious origin story for podcasts. But literally, this guy recommended this show to me, and I was like, all right, I like you. Let's try this. And I just absolutely fell in love with it.
but not the boy?
Oh, he's all right too.
Okay. I was going to say, well, not to get too personal, but what lasted longer, Hello Internet or the boy? I just would find irony in him recommending something that outlasted him.
Oh, no, we still geek out about these podcasts together.
Oh, okay. All right. As long as you guys are still cool. Yeah. Well, that's hey, word of mouth. Word of mouth is kind of a common way for people to find out about shows. And I mean, that's what we're doing here, right? So
absolutely.
Yeah. Hello Internet is a huge deal. I need to get on it. And it's interesting to me that you say it's worth kind of serializing it. It's worth going back to the beginning, huh?
Yeah, I would say that because you can enjoy it from a random episode, I think, but if you start at the beginning, you really, their personalities build over time, especially Gray, I feel like gets more and more open over the course of the podcast. And I think it adds a lot if you start at the beginning and grow with the community there.
Well, perfect. Well, there you go, folks. Links will be in the show notes for Hello Internet site and their Twitter account as well. And I know CGP Grey. I mean, I've been a Cortex listener since episode 1 for sure, and he is a very interesting guy. That's for sure. And I think that's one of the reasons he's probably got such a huge following on both the podcasting world as well as YouTube. I mean, what he does creatively, between the animation and writing is unreal. So I can definitely speak to that side of the coin as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, folks, those are 2 shows for you. Now we've got 2 more. So show number 3, The Talking Stick Comes Back to Me Now. My third one is one that I've recently come across recently, I'd say about 3 or 4 months ago. And, folks, I will say this. It might be the most important show I listen to. And I'll tell you why. First, let me tell you what it is right off the bat. It's Code Switch from NPR. Code Switch is a show, and I'm going to do my best to kind of quickly sort of pull this together and encapsulate what it is. From their what is Code Switch on their FAQ, it says, remember when folks used to talk about being post-racial? Well, we're definitely not that. They're a team of journalists fascinated by the overlapping themes of race, ethnicity, and culture, how they play out in our lives and communities, and how all of this is shifting. If you've been around the podcasting world for any amount of time, if you're a host or a listener, you probably have heard or read the attention that's been given to the lack of diversity, the lack of voices from women, especially women of color, or underrepresented point of views from those who are not always featured in the mainstream media. And as the most generic of white guys, I've made it a point to make sure that I am exposing, the input in my podcast listening to those voices that I don't get to hear every day. I live in the suburbs, okay? It's not every day, unfortunately, that I have the opportunity to hear the perspectives that I think don't get heard enough. And Code Switch is one of many, many shows out there, folks. They're all there. Between Another Round and Two Dope Queens and The Read, and there's so many other great shows out there. But Code Switch really is sort of NPR's effort at this. And they have the most eclectic and diverse producers and hosts and topics, and they throw a light on topics that I guarantee you is not covered by sort of the mass media. So with all the recent events in the world, they don't just go through sort of the facts of the news report. They pull out the individuals that were involved, dig deep on what those individuals' stories were, what their real experience was like, talk to the people who were involved, and sort of allow you to develop an opinion or a take on a particular topic that is sort of, like a wave kind of coming over our country right now in terms of the discussions that are happening about so many of these topics. And they don't tell you what to think or what's right or wrong. And that's not what I'm trying to do by recommending this show to you either. What I am saying is that the world of podcasting brings up a real opportunity to make sure that you don't have a siloed form of entertainment coming into your earbuds every time you hit play on the podcast, and that you're just not getting all your news from one news source. Code Switch is doing a great job, episode after episode right now, bringing those stories to light. And just one recent example, just right off the bat, of a recent episode, I believe, probably a few weeks old now, at the point that you guys are hearing this. Philando Castile, the gentleman who was killed by the police in Minnesota, they went and talked to his family and his friends in and around St. Paul and Minneapolis. And come to find out, since 2004, I believe, I'm doing some of this from memory, folks, but I believe since 2004, leading to his death, he was stopped by the police 46 times for random traffic stops. And various different reasons and causes and what have yous. And they talked to, the friends and the family about how that was even possible and what was going on there. And it's reports that I'd never heard of, and I'm somewhat a news junkie, and really sort of took you behind the scenes. Family members talking about the vehicle was probably being targeted and what have you. But, all these different things. And that's just one example of a lot of the stuff that's happening. And it's not just the podcast, folk. It actually links back over to a blog post and news reporting, and you have a Tumblr page. And this is sort of NPR's way of throwing a light onto subjects and topics that are probably not talked about enough. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. It is typical NPR, high production values, interviews, discussion, top of the line stuff, and I can't throw a recommendation stronger behind that. Code Switch is my second show recommendation. Have you heard about that one, Quinn?
I have heard about this one, but I've never listened to it, so maybe I should push it up more in my list.
Yeah, it's a good one. It's one of those ones where I'm completely engrossed every time I listen to it because it's always something new. It's very Reveal-like, and Reveal is one of my favorite shows ever in terms of sort of investigative journalism type thing. It's not true investigative journalism per se, but there's a lot of those elements and a lot of sort of shedding lights on stories that you may not know the full story about.
All right, but sounds great.
That's my second show recommendation, Code Switch from NPR. So, Quinn, what is your second show recommendation?
So, my second show is another one of those, small shows that really needs a boost. But so it's called Call Your Girlfriend. It's not the kind of show that I gather is generally recommended on this podcast. Not a tech podcast. It's hosted by two amazing women, Ann Friedman and Aminatu So. And it's actually more of a pop culture and politics podcast. Their tagline is a podcast for long-distance besties everywhere. And that's pretty much what it is. It sounds like you're listening to a really interesting phone conversation between two best friends. You are just listening into their insightful comments and jokes and opinions. And it really ranges from, insightful observations and commentary on politics and race and women's issues, all the way to a detailed breakdown of feuds related to Kanye and the Lemonade album. And so you really get the full gamut here, but it's always feminism focused. It's hilarious. These two ladies have really built a large podcast following out of this. They actually do some live shows even. There's a live show actually later this week coming up in LA, which unfortunately I'm nowhere close to LA, otherwise I'd be going. But I still get to enjoy their podcast every week, which what they've been doing for a while is they'll have one episode that's just Anne and Aminatu talking about current events and things that are interesting to them. And then the next week they'll have their Phone a Friend episode, which is one or the other of them calling a friend who is always incredibly interesting. They actually had their first male guest just a few weeks ago. Someone working, they were interviewing someone about the Democratic National Convention. So that was interesting, but they're almost always women who are doing really cool work in business or politics, and it gives you this really long reading list of people to catch up on and learn about, because you're always like, oh, that's so cool. I want to do that. I want to hear more about their project or their activism. And in the end, I can't stress how funny it is. Like, if you want a podcast that keeps you up to date with topics, gives you something to think about at the end with some kind of insightful analysis, and keeps you laughing, this is definitely the podcast for you.
It sounds like a great companion podcast to the one I just recommended. Sound like both of these would be great additions for people who want to make sure they're expanding their point of views. I
would definitely say that, yeah.
Perfect. We didn't even plan that, folks.
Synergy.
Yay. That's happened before. Well, I have heard of the show before, and like you said, they do have a huge following. I'm trying to figure out, are they fully blown independent?
I don't know what happened. So they're produced by Gina Delvac.
Right.
Who is a radio producer, but I'm not sure if there is any more team or if it's just the three of them.
Yeah, but they're not a part of a larger network at all, I don't believe.
No, I think they're just them.
Which is amazing. I'm on their About page right now on their website. They've got sort of one-liners, recommendations from Entertainment Weekly, BuzzFeed, The Guardian, LA Magazine, so on and so forth. So yes, this is definitely top-of-the-line stuff worth checking out, folks.
Yeah, I think I've been listening to this one for a long time too, and I think I got it just by Googling podcast to listen to, and it was one of the first ones that came up.
Awesome. Very cool. I'm trying to think too. I believe this was referenced in Chicago as well. The ladies from Another Round were one of our closing keynote speakers, and I believe they talked about this as well as terms of other shows that folks could be listening to. So
yeah. If you listen to Another Round, you would definitely like Call Your Girlfriend.
Perfect. Well, folks, those are 4 great show recommendations that, and I have to admit, this is a pretty good stable, I say. Quinn brought Call Your Girlfriend and Hello Internet, and I told you about Someone Knows Something and Code Switch. So I think if you add those 4 to your subscription list, you're going to have hours and hours of awesome listening right there. So I think we did good, Quinn. What do you think?
I think it went pretty well.
Awesome. Well, before I let you go, please take as much time as you like. I want you to tell people where they can find your YouTube channel, your podcast, your blog. We didn't even touch on the blog, but tell folks everything about and how to follow you on Twitter, like all the cool relay people are doing.
All right. So my links and various things. I'm on Twitter at AspiringRobotFM. My website is aspiringrobot.com. My YouTube is Aspiring Robot, one word, all lowercase. And I actually also have a Tumblr in which I post very amateur arts, and that's aspiringrobot.tumblr.com.
All right. Obvious question. One more. Tell me about the Aspiring Robot. Where did this come from? Are you aspiring to be a robot, Quinn?
I am aspiring to a robot. You're actually the first person who's asked me that question.
What?
I know. No one's ever actually asked.
Break into it. Now you have your opportunity. I've got it. Put this explanation out to the world.
All right. My quick explanation. So if you go to my website, the front page says, "Hello, my name is Quinn Rose and I aspire to be a robot." And I do, for many complicated reasons, having to do with perfectionism and wanting to make really cool stuff. But I have to admit that the name was actually inspired originally. Well, the idea of a robot was originally inspired by the Incomparable Network and CGP Grey. So my podcast roots will always be there, no matter what.
So robot or not, I think that was one of your 22 podcasts,
22. Although it's gone up by 4 since I posted that video.
and I love it. It's so funny. This is why I think it's just so great. You were like 22 podcasts in 2 minutes, and then I look at the total length. It's like 135, and then you're like in the comments after editing, it actually was 135. Like that is great. That's awesome. I just think it's like I think it allows you room for expansion. Right? It could become 33 podcasts in 2 minutes.
Yeah. Keep your eyes peeled for the sequel. And if my current rate of podcast edition keeps going, that's going to be in 3 weeks. So.
Wow, it's going to be and those are the pain, right? Though that videos like that, when you're including the graphics and the jump cuts, that probably took you longer for that minute 34 or whatever than most others twice the length, right?
Yeah, that one was a little troublesome, but it was really fun to make too, so I didn't mind.
Well, go check it out, folks. Go check out Quinn's YouTube channel, her podcast, all the fun stuff. Quinn, it's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you so much. The pleasure is all mine.
Folks, that will do it for episode 103 of the Podcast Digest, another recommendation show in the books, which means I will be back again next week with another great interview, taking you behind the scenes of some of your current or soon-to-be favorite shows on the internet. Folks, that will do it. Until next time, my name's Dan Lizette for the Podcast Digest.
Thank you for listening to the Podcast Digest. You can follow the show on Twitter at PodDigest. Like the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Podcast Digest. Email the show feedback at thepodcastdigest@gmail.com. And you can find all the previous episodes and exclusive blog entries at the show's website, thepodcastdigest.info.